Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. This is Megan with Able Cine, and I am really excited today to be joined by Richard Rutkowski, ASC. Richard, how are you doing today?
Terrific. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm a big fan of your work, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I know you've prepped a lot of work for us to take a look at. So before we get started, let me kind of intro more about you, and then also for our viewers, the plan for the conversation. So Richard Rutkowski AC is an active cinematographer whose work encompasses indie features, art and gallery projects, and major studio productions. Richard's cinematography has contributed to acclaimed dramas, including Boss, The Americans, and the period drama Manhattan, which earned Richard two separate ASC Awards nominations for Best Cinematography. Recent work also includes HBO's Divorce, Amazon's Jack Ryan, and Castle Rock for Hulu. So quite the body of work there, Richard. Thank you for joining us. The Americans is one of my all-time favorite shows, actually.
Oh, that's sweet. It was a very good show, and I was very fortunate to be hired on the first season. And I enjoyed working with those producers, writers, directors. The cast was extraordinary. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really compelling. So looking forward to getting to know more about you. Everyone that's watching, thank you for joining us. Please write in your questions in the chat, and we will have an Able Cine moderator, Alex, who's on the call with us, chime in with your questions. So please feel free to add to that because we do want this to be a conversation. So with that, I'll go ahead and continue with Richard. Richard, let's get started with getting to know you a little bit more. Tell us how you got started into the film industry, or what was it that sparked your interest?
Well, I actually started in theater. I was doing a lot of theater in college, and I was lighting theater and staging and a little bit of directing. And then I caught the bug with some 16 millimeter film classes, and this was back in the 1980s. So you started on film on 16, black and white reversal, and then color reversal, and then sync sound. And I gradually built up my ambition to do bigger and bigger projects, and that sort of overtook the thoughts I had about either doing something in theater or working as an engineer or an architect. And I got out of college having made two relatively ambitious short films and found myself needing work. So I wound up joining the local camera unions in Boston and getting on jobs and starting my work right from the beginning as a loader and a second assistant, and then becoming a focus puller. And throughout the time I was in the union and doing assistant work, I was also shooting. I would either shoot projects for myself or for others. And, I never went to film school. I sort of learned while doing. And I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate in that, stumbling into it in that way, I wound up working with a really diverse and interesting set of cinematographers and took away a great deal of lessons, but also perspective from each one of them. So early on, a British cinematographer named Freddie Francis, and I was the second AC on a film with him. And then working with Ed Lachman, who's quite legendary and quite accomplished, an amazing intellect as well as a cameraman. And then, too many to mention. I mean, Tom Richmond, Nancy Schreiber, Eric Edwards, and I did a lot of work together, including work, with Gus Van Sant, and that was exceptional. And then, with David Stockton, I did commercials. I was very fortunate. I worked with Peter Bijou, actually as an operator. By then I started operating. I worked with Maddie Libatique on the movies Requiem for a Dream and Number 23 and Iron Man and Never Die Alone. And I learned so much from Maddie, who, what was interesting was I had hired Maddie essentially on his first job. He was in a film office and wanted to get into camera. And there I was. And, Ed was in LA and needed help. And so I introduced Maddie to Ed Lachman. And through this accumulation of experiences and meeting people, I really felt like I built a strong background in how to handle different issues on different types of shoots, because there's a great variety of types of shoots. And I was very observant the whole time. I remember thinking to myself, keep your ears open, because the conversation's right in front of the lens while you're fixing up the next roll of film or setting the lens. You're obviously hearing the conversations between a cast and a director, and they're quite extraordinary. So that was my way in. And it's a long route. You work hard. You do a lot of big, long, complicated shoots, but you gain the perspective you need then to run a crew efficiently yourself.
Right. Absolutely. And can't wait to talk about that. I think it's interesting you brought up, keeping your ears open because, you learn so much while you're working, even, as you've worked on these really large projects. Um, another thing I wanted to bring up is since you started in theater, do you think there's things that you pull from that experience that maybe help you differently than someone who hadn't had that experience?
Well, it's a different style of lighting, but in
Mhm.
that, all lighting is essentially some form of stylization, even when you're trying to light as naturalistically as possible, or when you're working with natural light and you're shaping it, you're inevitably, instituting some element of your own style into how you're lighting the frame. I feel like the theater experience and learning to light a black box from scratch was very good for that. And
Mhm.
mostly from the theater, I took away two things. One was sensitivity to the performer, because inevitably we are at the service of a script and a performer, and the more observant, and the more sensitive, and the more aware and open-eyed you are to what the performer is doing or warming up to do or struggling with, the better off you're going to be. And then I took away a sense of abstraction, the idea that nothing needs to actually flow at the pace of life to be part of a life story. Nothing needs to be specifically representative to have an impact on an audience. Because in the theater, we pretend we're in 1,000 different places without leaving a certain square footage of the stage. So I took away that capability of the imagination, and I'd like to think that I try to bring that forward into things, even when we're trying to be as realistic as possible in a presentation. You're really in the car is really crashing. Well, obviously not. The car is not crashing. The car is in a controlled stunt moment. The characters are either truly in the vehicle as it's in danger, or we've switched them out for stunt people, or it's completely done with a visual effect. But the more you understand the power of that, the better you're able to tell that story and have a better impact with the way you're telling it.
Right, absolutely. And part of our topic today, this is our creative forces series. So a lot of it is about, where you pull inspiration from and how you go about telling your story. And so I know you've gathered a series of stills and paintings for us. And before we take a look at that, I just wanted to intro that subject as well. How and why do you think that you started looking at art? Is that something you did at a younger age, or is that something you did later on to find inspiration?
Well, I'll preface that with a bit of personal history. My father was a painter. My father was a landscape painter, oil on canvas, what they call plein air, which means you go out and you paint in the location. Sometimes you bring it back to the studio to finish it, but your initial work on the canvas takes place on the actual site, and you're essentially capturing that moment of the landscape, which we'll talk about a little more as we go through these images. But having an artist for a father, I was not interested in being in the arts at all. I mean, that's the irony of your children and growing up, is they don't generally want to do what you do. And so I was a little bit resistant to anyone saying, oh, you could work in the arts like your dad. I wanted to do something with engineering, architecture, something technical. That's why I was drawn to certain elements of the theater which required a technical capacity, and I liked the performing aspects of things. But as happens, the way I got into the film business and then started looking more closely at art stills and sculpture and performance, and saying like, oh, I can draw on this and this and this to work in the film. I, of course, came back to things that my father would say when he was alive, things he would say either standing in front of his own work or someone else's, standing on a location, going to a museum. And, in your memory, you're very bored and you don't want to be in the museum. But of course, all those comments come back. So I have that as a background. And then once I got involved in making films, I realized, partly through Ed Lockman and Eric Edwards, who were very tied into the world of stills, how much the influence of still photography existed on the screen, even where you weren't necessarily seeing it, even when it wasn't completely present in the film image. There was a real impact to some of the work of certain photographers going back 100 years. And that got me into collecting the books and going and seeing photography, purchasing photography. And then from that, I've developed a certain sense of which photographers or which schools of photography I might turn to when I start a project. And I find that the photography books, books about painting, looking at older films, looking at newer films or television shows, gives myself, the director, the production designer, a common starting point to have a conversation. And quite often when I come into the conversation, the production designer has already been working, has built a lookbook, has started to define a palette, and I come in and I want to, create something anew with the director, and directors usually want to have my input into what it can be. Very few directors are so dogmatically visual that they insist on it being, only their voice. And so I'm very grateful for that, because it means I can bring some of what I know from my background and from my own, preferences into the conversation early and start planning for how a show can look. And especially one hopes how a show can look unique. And we're going to look at these images, but I want to stress that everyone else on this call right now, everyone else that works in this capacity would bring a different set of images or a different set of artists. And that's perfectly great. It's exciting. These are just a few that I thought to bring in because, not just because I love the images, but also because when I look at them, I think about what went into making them. What was the background of the creative space, the motivation of the artist or the photographer. And then even though I have no interest in replicating a photo in our work, for a new show, I do sometimes have an interest in replicating that same motivation, understanding what the defining characteristic of the style and the original genesis of that photograph or painting was, and then bringing that forward into our work. And of course, it's also, it's delightful to have this as a profession. It's delightful to be open to this level of input from these sources, all of which are just marvelous. So it's it's one of the things I love the most, actually, is in the pre-production process, having this conversation. And I think it's important. I know that a lot of these conversations you want to have in this forum or other forums are about the technical aspect. How do you achieve a certain technical end? Or logistically, how do you achieve this? Or how did you get this job to begin with is also often a question. I think it's important to talk about what is it that draws the creative side of you into play. I mean, I'm going to spend upwards of 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week working with a group of individuals towards a common goal of a show. I'd like to think that there's this really compelling set of images and or ideas that are going to be able to be forwarded through that it's not simply saying, okay, now let's do a doctor show, now let's do a supernatural show, that there's something underlying all of that, and that you bring those techniques forward. So that's a long-winded introduction to some images, and I'll talk a little bit through the images as we go, but then we'll have a chance to watch them silently, because I'm sure that everything I have to say about some of these images, other people will see something different or more unique than I've seen, and I'd like them to have that time as well.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you. So Avery, you can go ahead and cue those clips for us.
So this first and obviously sentimental choice is a painting of my father's, my late father Casimir, called Highland Terrace. And this is a view that essentially no longer exists. It's in Bridgehampton, near where I grew up. And these fields and this situation of the land is gone. And it's very much a depiction of light at that time. This is a painter that influenced him, a guy named Fairfield Porter. And this is called Morning Light. And I think what strikes me about this image, besides the composition and the beautiful gestural painterly strokes, is that it is capturing a moment in light, which is obviously part of our job as well. Here's another painting by Fairfield Porter. It's called Anne in a Striped Dress, and it's a portrait of his wife. What is compelling to me in this frame is that it's actually a landscape, also a portrait, also a still life, because the red draped fabric coming off of the chair is the most three-dimensional thing. It's coming at the viewer. And Anne is very graphic in her striped dress, and then the landscape behind her is very two-dimensional, emphasized by the fact that there's two-dimensional photos on the wall of his studio. This is another portrait, another concentric portrait by a photographer named Malik Sidibe from Mali. What I love about this is it's the square frame, which he emphasizes with the cross-hatched base under her feet and the stripe going down the side of the frame. And I feel like that's just an incredibly strong compositional tool. Plus, you have this wonderful access to this individual who's really, unique and beautiful to look at. So I think it's very accomplished. This is another Malik Sidibe image, and this one's taken with a flash during a party. And things like this, where you're in the action are something I often look at for how can we get this feeling into something we're doing on film or television. You're a character in the action. The wonderful Henri Cartier-Bresson talked about the decisive moment, well exampled here, and he said that your head, your heart, and your hand all had to work in one split second to capture an image like this. And he said usually you're pulling the trigger just before you thought you needed to get the best image. Very telling. This is William Eggleston. Now, Eggleston, I really am a tremendous fan of. He worked with color, and his sense of color and his nuance of color is exceptional. And his sense of character, there's always seems to be some bit of a story forming in a William Eggleston frame. And he worked with dye transfer prints, which results in a decreased saturation, which I enjoy and sometimes try to exploit. This is the famous Robert Frank. Now, most people who are listening know about Robert Frank. What I love about Robert Frank is that you're in the action of his photo and you're carefully observing the behavior of people. There's usually a societal element that he's trying to exemplify. And he also just captures these split seconds. And I often think about Robert Frank when I'm trying to achieve something. This is Nan Goldin, and I'm very impressed in always referencing Nan Goldin. She puts herself in the image. This is her boyfriend, Brian, obviously right in the middle of drinking and smoking and watching the Flintstones. And she loves to use off color temperatures. She's shooting slide film, so sometimes the film and then the resulting print represents these bizarre colors that become because of the slide film. Here, very importantly, she is in the image and she's controlling this image utterly. She's holding the camera just out of the mirror perspective. She's using a flash on the ceiling, which creates the light in the foreground. And she is very much the subject of this photo while taking it. And this is part of her series, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency. For those who have never looked at it, it's a mind-blowing book and one I'm constantly looking at. This is another look at how to take a personal photo, but it's not a photo, it's a painting. It's Edward Hopper, and Edward Hopper is much referenced. Robbie Mueller used to say that Edward Hopper was his main teacher for cinematography. And here you've got this isolation within a frame of this room, and the lighting is what's available from the ceiling. So there's this very straightforward and very logical thing, but you've got this enhanced emotional aspect to it. I go back to Nan Goldin because, like the character on the right, this character is slightly isolated in this frame, and it's always compelling when your portrait is of someone who's not looking near or at the lens. This person, this sort of right in the middle of this party is looking off camera, and that draws you in even more. Now here's another Hopper painting, and again, a character in isolation, and many of the composition techniques that I talk to operators about are like myself. Her feet are cut at the bottom of the frame. The screen is cut off at the side of frame. The frame is very strongly divided down the middle. There's an enormous amount of emotional energy in the choices of the colors. And by the way, everybody's socially distanced here at this movie theater, so we can go back. I want to go back. The Hopper was a big influence on Far From Heaven, the film that Ed Lachman shot for Todd Haynes. This is a woman named Helen van Meen, a Dutch photographer. Her color is exquisite. Her color is just exquisite. And she shoots in the square format like Malik Sidibe. But her images in a square often have like a curve in them. They have a sort of twist inside the frame. Here again, the woman looking off, the blowing bubble, her hair is in her hands, she's entangled. The light is beautiful, the colors are beautiful, and there's a certain isolation and entanglement inside this frame, even though outwardly you would think these characters are very beautiful. Now here's Harry Callahan. Harry Callahan, a black and white photographer from Chicago. I really love Harry Callahan's composition, and I really love the majesty of the spaces he photographs. He really photographs a space. And here the ceiling hangs heavy in the top of the frame. It lends it a real character and a real quality, which then his wife, Eleanor, at the bottom of the frame is so diminutive. It's a real tension. And here again, a divided frame in a rectangle. This is Harry Callahan again, and he's contrasting these two women caught in, mid-step walking down a Chicago street, and this woman mid-dance on a television screen. And it's a very interesting image. You can watch it, you watch your eye move around it quite a bit. And those kinds of compositions are very attractive to me. This is Danny Lyon, who did a whole sequence of photographs in a Texas prison. And I like this photo for the placement of the lens. The lens is direct overhead. It's a flat table, flat benches, a flat floor, flat dominoes. And so you'd think, oh, this is an image that doesn't have depth to it, and yet it has tremendous depth, despite the graphic linear flatness of it. Similarly, with William Eggleston, he's shooting into a flat wall, and his photograph is really about light and color, but he got a very unique perspective by putting the lens essentially right on the carpet. So I like to imagine Eggleston either on his side or on his back with the, getting his eye to the eyepiece to get this image. It really makes these common furnitures monumental, which I like. This is another Eggleston, and it references his history growing up in the South. He was from Memphis and spent a lot of his life there and shot around the South mostly. And this is like a double portrait within a landscape. And it's quite exciting to see this image. And I like the way the color's been drained through the dye transfer printing process, and yet it is a colorful image. I have to do something here. This is Robert Frank, and Robert Frank is known for those types of photographs we looked at before where he's capturing a person in the act of something or in a state. Here he's capturing an entire valley as a landscape, and yet the foreground is a still life. The foreground is still life of the shears framing this deep perspective point landscape, which then brings me to a landscape painter I love, Edward Vuillard, one of the Nabby painters. Now, this image is 6 feet plus across. It hangs in Chicago. What I love about this image, the graphicness and the flattening of the planes, is belied by the fact that you can go between the deep red of a piece of clothing of the woman in the window to the deep red of a man in the field, and then you've got the cobalt in the trees playing with a cobalt on the person in the foreground. Then you've got a bright green field on one side and a bright green field on the other. So it's almost this play of the colors around, and also a language sort of develops in that. And I also love the way he cuts the frame. I love the way he cuts the side of the building and cuts the bottom of the roof line in the foreground. Your mind fills that in, your mind expands it. Then this is Pierre Bernard, Dining Room in the Country. And just like the Fairfield Porter painting we'd looked at earlier, there's several paintings in one here. There's a landscape in the background. There's a portrait of a woman framed in a window. There's a little cat on a chair on the right and a chair on the left. And then there's this cutoff table for like a still life in the foreground. And the colors are unbelievable. The colors, the simplicity of the title, Dining Room in the Country, it doesn't even approach how psychedelic it is to stand in front of this painting, very emotional. Now we get to David Hockney, and David Hockney has a lot of these same characteristics that we've just been talking about. He's graphic in terms of how he's treating this background. This is from a friend's home in the south of France that he spent time in, and Hockney took a lot of photographs of this with the pool against this deep view of a valley beyond. And then he staged this painting called Portrait of an Artist. And there's a great ambiguity between what's the relationship of the artist, we assume in the salmon jacket, who seems to be nearly falling in or interrupting the swimmer. And in fact, the painting was painted about an ex-lover of Hockney's. This painting became the most expensive painting sold at auction by a living artist. It sold for $80 million. And when Christie's added its bit of it, it was over $90 million. I stood with this painting in London before it was sold, and I was really quite moved by it. And interestingly enough, most of the shows we do cost far more than that $90 million. So here's Hockney in his studio painting that. And what fascinates me is he doesn't even have the protagonist of the painting in yet. He's dealt with all the volumes, all the compositional elements are in the foreground for him, and he's going to put the other character in after. And he's taped up to it photographs. So just like we're talking about the sources you use to be able to do work, he's got his sources taped on the canvas. I'm going to be quiet and let these images go by. Okay.
I love that.
Oh, thanks. I was very grateful to be able to find that photograph of Hockney making that painting because, a lot of people watch shows we do and they think, oh, they just intended that right from the beginning. Well, sometimes it takes an evolution, and it certainly is a conversation that begins before I'm even brought into a project. I mean, there's writing done, there's a script, there's a revision of a script, there's a studio that gets behind a project, and perhaps they want it to be something completely new, or perhaps they see it as an updated version of a model they know works, or a merging of genres that they haven't seen before. But there's a lot of things that happen before I'm involved, and they hire a director, and the director brings their aesthetic and their sense of knowledge of the effective visual to it. And then my main hope through bringing sources to the party, or talking about other work that people have done, or looking at old films together, or looking at whatever strikes our fancy to make sure that we're thinking originally about the work. The main import is not to go copy someone else's image necessarily. The main import is to understand why that image is working, and then have a plan to create images yourself that work on some of those same themes. I mean, in those set of images, there were themes about daylight and capturing daylight. There were themes of isolation. There were certain compositional techniques that I think are very strong and like to bring up. And that certainly isn't the whole run of what I might bring as a set of images or a set of sources, but it's a good start. And when we first initially talked about doing this podcast, I was like, well, what can I bring that's going to be slightly different? And I thought this would help. And, if we're going to look at work I've done, different shows, it's not like I can point to something and say, oh, yes, that's the Edward Hopper influence, or, oh, yes, of course, that's Malik Sidibe's framing of a portrait. It doesn't work that way. It's more nuanced than that. You get into the characters and the drama that you're going to tell, and then you want to bring along something of what you learned from other people, and more than the specifics of the texture, the information, the color saturation. You're looking to bring their motivation, because you're hoping that you equally will rise to a high level of technique and show that kind of clear motivation in the work you show. And so I don't want to confuse this with like, oh, I just copy these and then I'm very happy. No, it's more nuanced than that.
Right. I think one of the things I was thinking too, listening to you describe them and watching them myself, is, I think sometimes we're also trying to emulate the emotion that we feel when we see a certain painting. So that's not just because of composition or just because of how the light was painted, but how does it make us feel? And then maybe that's the feeling we want to try to capture.
Yes, yeah, I would agree. And that one Hopper image called New York Movie is very telling in that regard. You weirdly enough, for being at such a, he's not like Robert Frank or Nan Goldin. He's not up in the picture himself. He's not interacting with the character on the canvas. He's at a certain formal remove, but his technique and his skill set and his line and his the perfection of the way the light falls is so engaging that you can't help but feel like you can almost experience that moment she's in. And you, perhaps in a deja vu like way, you've seen this once yourself.
Right. So now when you're thinking of how to incorporate all of these elements into motion, now with a moving image, what are the types of things that you think about it during that pre-production mindset when you're approaching a story?
Well, it's quite varied, and it starts to become a little bit of logistics, and it starts to become a little bit the real estate of time and where you want to spend the most real estate. But mostly, when I've worked with really wonderful directors, and we're going to talk with Mike Uppendahl later on this podcast, mostly it's about understanding what the scene is about. Like, what is this scene about? What does the audience have to leave this scene understanding? And what state is the best state to generate so that the storytelling is cohesive? I'm of the opinion that people want to go on a trip with you. It's just a matter of how consistent they feel you are in the storytelling. And sometimes it's really remarkable. You can tune into something. My friend Eric Messerschmidt shoots Mindhunter. Every time a Mindhunter image shows up on the screen, I know it's Mindhunter. It's a very specific palette, or The Night Of, Igor Martinovic did. Any image from the Night Of, I'm very clear when I see it show up on my laptop or even small phone or something. I'm like, oh yeah, that's The Night Of. And you kind of hope that you're going to achieve that. You kind of hope that you're going to achieve a stylistic forwardness that isn't out in front of the drama, isn't out in front of the performance, but is the safe sort of boat that you can travel the lake of the story with the audience, and you're not going to overtake anything. You're not going to be you're not going to bury everything in the technique, but at the same time, you're going to hold everyone's attention creatively throughout.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed in talking with you these last few weeks, and also meeting you a long time ago on the set of Boss, is a lot of that prep work that you do. And we also touched on, you have to be willing to obviously be flexible, because now you're on location and things can change. But that prep work gives you, that grounding. So I
Yeah.
wondered if you could talk a minute about, like how how as a DP and creative are you flexible? Like how does someone learn to do that?
Well, you learn from others. I mean, I learned by working as an assistant for many years, and I watched wonderful directors and wonderful cinematographers working with actors, and I came to understand that by the time you've brought your ideas to the set, and I think Michael Uppendahl would attest to this, by the time you've brought your ideas to the set, you then have to see what the performer is doing, and you have to be very attentive. And not only that, you have to be open, because if the performer is pushing something in a new direction, it's not anything but your opportunity to do better with that. And I'm attentive to that need. I sometimes talk to the operators about the need to never cut the camera if you feel like the actor or something about the scene is still playing out. Just don't cut. You may well get something remarkable. And like that Robert Frank photo of the woman in the elevator, sometimes people's faces just take on this moment, and you have to be willing to just roll. You have to be willing to just roll camera and get it, whether it's part of the take or not. The other thing I would say is that I often talk to the operators about your documenting a performance. So, I started doing documentaries while I was in college, and I like the documentary in the cinema verite form. In some ways, it's like plein air painting. It's like you're working with exactly what's in front of you. But importantly, the performance the actor is going to give, and you can feel it when it's sort of building, especially if you're right there, you can feel it. That performance is unique, and it's your job to document it, to actually capture it as if this were documentary. Now, you have all the tools necessary to shape that later, to cut around, to fix a mismatch, or to accelerate something that moves slowly. But I always find it very exciting to try and keep a performance intact, throughout an entire take.
Absolutely. So with that, I would love to take a look with the audience with some of your work in motion. Do you want to intro this clip a little bit?
Yeah. There's a few things I'm showing, and one of the ones I'm going to show is made very simply, and so it's up first. It was made in the year 2000, and it was shot in PAL. We shot it in PAL. This was a period of time when people were trying to shoot little movies on mini DV, and it was after The Celebration, which was so beautifully shot by Anthony Dodd Mantle. And so we took a Sony PD-150 and shot primarily in the streets of New York and locations. We had no stage work whatsoever. And we did a little movie called Homework, directed by Kevin Asher Green. And I think, still holds up quite interestingly, even though it's standard definition, shot PAL so that we could transfer one frame of the video to one frame of film. And because, again, of the limitations of these cameras, we were often zoomed way in. So why don't we go ahead and start? So we're using entirely available light. We're using the long end of the zoom lens of the camera. It helps defocus backgrounds. That's Isaac de Bancalet, and the young lady is played by Paz de la Huerta. And this is a story of her falling in love with, almost to an infatuation with, her dance teacher. So here she's stalking him in the subways. I love available light. Now, if I can control some of it, I absolutely will. Or if I can, in this case, balance the camera to it. We were constantly re-white balancing these cameras to achieve certain color effects. But when you're working in these real situations or available light, it just makes you realize how aesthetic the world is around you. It's really a matter of your finding your point of view in it. And here we intentionally used out of focus because of her state of mind, and then we racked focus between things. And again, a night exterior. Now, of course, it helps that you're zoomed way in, so you're essentially cheating and avoiding lots of unlit space. But I like the way this plays in terms of her state of mind. I can see the hopper thing there, actually. And this is a little bit painterly in terms of the color scheme and a little bit of desaturation. It's all handheld.
In fact, he intends to provide you with all the tools necessary for your transition to higher courts.
He sent you to apologize for him?
No. But I am. Apologizing.
You're new in his office. Just like the woman I met. She was quite impressive. I bet you'd like to be impressive, too.
I would.
Then perhaps we can be of mutual benefit to one another.
That was my thinking.
Now, it's all handheld, but you forget that. This was one of the things I learned at Boss is if you're just doing handheld the whole time, people eventually stop paying attention to that aspect of it. It's just where you put the camera. And here, very specifically, we're putting the American flag on one side and the Chicago flag on the other, and the judge's activity is going to occur right in front of the scales of justice. So, not an accident.
I noticed that about the handheld work. It steadies and then it picks back up again. So a nice rhythm too.
And you jump the line. And you've jumped the line, and it'd be no reason to think or why or what. It's for an expressive element. Rather than being on his face, we want it to be on his ear and the sound. So then the next piece is from the Americans, and this is a long piece, and it plays out silently. This was directed by Tommy Schlamme, and I love this section. This sort of notorious thing that happens. The setup is that his wife, Carrie Russell, this character, has been out for almost an entire day trying to elude the KGB and the CIA. And next thing you know, she finally gets back home, and she's been having a problem of a impacted tooth, a very sore tooth. And now because she's on the run, she can't go to a dentist. That's the setup. I love how simple we got with the lighting for this. I hope people at home have a controlled lighting environment around them because it's a dark scene, but I like very how simple this became. And very, very much like some of those stills of Nan Goldin's, you're sort of implicated here. You're so close to the performer that you're almost implicated in the embrace and then in what's about to follow. You feel a deep presence, to the action. He's a remarkable performer. I mean, they're taking on, explaining that it's time for this tooth to come out, and they're taking it on essentially on their face. I often talk about the landscape of the face. I have a great love of landscape, but I also have a great love of seeing everything play out on the human face, big.
One thing I loved about the Americans and how everything was portrayed is everything they're going through. And I think what you said right there about on their face, you really feel what they're going through. You also feel the love that they have for each other, but also this, they're in such a different dichotomy too of what they have to do.
And what they think is best for their children.
Exactly.
Where they think their kids should grow up. So we wanted this to have a certain serious grittiness because they're doing makeshift dentistry in a basement. So I didn't want to sugarcoat this or glamorize it, of course. And so it's pretty much source motivated lighting. I did put in a low weird color to the fill light. I really am going to stop talking because I love this scene. I had to get so close to the performers that I could feel their breath on me throughout the shooting. Now, in my view, that image is frozen, but it's not frozen going out, is it? Okay, good. So I'm assuming we're in black now. The next clip is from the Jack Ryan pilot, and a very different color scheme than anything you've seen prior in these clips. The Jack Ryan pilot was supposed to take place in something like 8 different countries, so we created different color looks to help with that geography, and this is a marketplace chase. I hope it's playing right now.
We got a meet and greet. 2 military-age males, table, north edge of the market. Guys, give me some audio on that table.
ببحث لازم نستعمل بيتك الحين. قضية خاصة.
Overwatch is in position. I have eyes on.
If I can just get a thumbs up when the clip is done.
Guys, your audio is fucked. I can't hear a fucking thing. Can somebody fix the goddamn audio? Do we have a lip reader? Jesus Christ, people. They're Oscar Mike. I no longer have.
Oh, bummer.
That was strange because I thought it seemed like it was working on our end and then paused.
Well, Mike, this could be what happens if we try to do live television.
Well, that's fun of it.
No, they're working on it, so we'll let them figure it out.
Thanks.
I just started thinking I could rewatch The Americans. This would be a good time to do it.
It seems like with the COVID, people have been rewatching all manner of. I watch old films.
Hey everyone, we're back. Sorry about that. Just a little bit of a technical hiccup, but now we're back. We're going to take a look at a clip from Jack Ryan. So Richard, go ahead and take us into this.
You know, the Jack Ryan pilot was supposed to take place in like 8 different countries, and most of these were created, especially all the Middle Eastern stuff was created in Morocco. And here it's supposed to be a Yemeni marketplace and a bit of surveillance and a takedown in a Yemeni marketplace. I don't see what's playing right now, but I can tell you that one of the things that was very important is that you don't have an establishing shot, that you're lost in the perspectives of all these different players and how they're approaching their goal. The perspective keeps shifting from our main protagonist Matisse and his van, and then you move around to people that are standing by a fruit cart, and they are obviously in on it, and then there's a sniper up in a window, and then there's a woman who approaches the table directly with a microphone on a pen. I think all this is kind of reminiscent of a source that I brought forward to the table in the prep of this. It's the filmmaker Costa Gravis. A lot of it handheld, but also a lot of it on long lenses on tripods. And the color scheme was very specific. We wanted it to be Yemen, and Yemen didn't want to look like Afghanistan, and Yemen didn't want to look like Syria, and Yemen didn't want to look like Lebanon, which is the framing piece of the show. We'll see a piece of Lebanon later. And because it's about spying, there's a lot of different telephoto perspectives, and you're meant as an audience to get a little bit lost yourself. Okay, what's happening? Who's looking at whom? Who's chasing whom? Then eventually, it becomes very clear.
Jesus Christ, people. They're Oscar, Mike.
I no longer have visual.
What do you want to do?
A whip pan to an out of focus person, all of it saying, okay, what's happening? How do we catch up to this? What are we going to do? We're in a crowded public space.
Set containment to
The actor on the left, John Hoganacre, and I have worked together a few times now. I actually met him on Boss, and he's totally wonderful, really great guy. And again, who's watching who? You have people in doorways, women behind veils. Who's really the pursued and the pursuing here? That's what happens if it's bad ratings. So like the beginning of the sequence where we had a van approaching us with a distant perspective, here it's going away from us down an empty street with lots of atmosphere. And then the next piece is Castle Rock, episode 103, directed by Michael Uppendahl, who we get to talk to right after this. And again, you just saw one color look. Here's a completely different color look, a completely different set of references, and a completely different intention with what the color and the contrast are doing for the shot. And Noel Fisher is quite wonderful in this, and he's a guard in Shawshank Prison. However, he's becoming more and more convinced that he's its prisoner. This merges a few different locations. That exterior was done in West Virginia. This is in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. I loved the idea to pull out and slam the gate on the camera like you're trapped in with him. Then he becomes a silhouette. Michael talked about The Tenant, a movie called The Tenant, which I deeply love as well. Roman Polanski. And then this is back at the West Virginia prison in totally natural light, and this wonderful idea of being able to do a long shot and then a tight close-up and then pan it around and find a close-up through the prison grates of the other character played by Bill Skarsgård.
As soon as I testify, we're both getting out of this shithole. The whole world beyond these walls. You see those cameras? I got eyes on you.
And we're supposed to believe that the kid hasn't had contact with human society in decades, so he doesn't know, like fist bump, or doesn't know basic things. And then we went a low-angle prism to get that perspective. That was a challenging perspective. And I really love how sensitive this focus pull was. It took a moment to bring the focus back to Bill Skarsgård and his character left back alone in a jail cell. It was very strong set of shots for that sequence. The next and the last of the long sequences is from the show Manhattan. This one's directed by Tommy Schlamme. Manhattan is the show where I met Michael Uppendahl. This scene talks about the human cost of war, and the scientists at Los Alamos thought that the atom bomb might actually cut the war short and save hundreds of thousands of lives, if not millions. And this character, the professor, Dr. Winter, is photographing his chalkboards so that he can bring his equations over to a new laboratory he's been given. But he's interrupted by a character who we've seen killed in a previous episode. So the question is this character there or not?
Never thought I'd say it, but I'm gonna miss this shithole. No, you're gonna miss it too, just watch. You'll have an army of PhDs at your beck and call, a desk the size of a Studebaker.
You wish you were back in this closet with 6 guys and a theory written on the back of an envelope.
You don't owe me anything, Frank. You didn't force me to take those papers. If you hadn't turned me over, the project would be dead in the water.
Stylistically, the lighting on the ghost character is different than the naturalistic lighting on the rest of the space. And Dr. Winter, you can see here, he's in a very modeled light versus the more naturalistic light. And when a certain light effect starts playing on the room, it won't play on him. He'll be excluded. Really?
Sorry, yeah. Well, I haven't seen this happen before, but it looks like a...
Avery, do you believe it got into that clip at all? Okay.
Richard, we're wondering if it's a copyright issue of YouTube catching the clips because it's only happening then. So we may have to. We may be safest.
Last one then.
Yeah, we may be safest skipping that one, and we'll just come back to our conversation.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, but we could still talk about it and make sure,
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. That's interesting. Copyright, too good a quality.
All right, we're back, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there with us. Sorry about a couple of technical hiccups. Richard, thank you so much for showing that beautiful body of work. It's really wonderful to see all the different styles and stories that you've told, over the years. So thank you for sharing that with us.
I appreciate it. I'm sorry this got interrupted for whatever technical reason, although our daughter Daisy says if I get involved in something, it takes 3 times as long. So there goes your proof.
Well, you'll have to tell her that later. I'm sure she would enjoy that. I know we've got a couple of questions from the audience. I wanted to ask you one thing before we get into that, but the first piece we looked at, you talked about, not having a lot of budget, not having a lot of lighting and crew and everything. And then of course you've worked on much, larger productions. So I wondered if you could maybe just speak a little bit about, when you're working on a project, looking at the tools that you have and the budget that you have and how you can kind of still construct, those images were still absolutely stunning. And sometimes people think they have to have, this largest budget ever. So think through that process a little bit.
Well, thank you. I'm proud of that work because it did start and stayed with a very small team to make a feature film. And it was a feature film that won the grand jury prize at Slam Dance that year. So I was very proud of it. I thought the performers were very compelling. I thought the script was good and understated. And the most important part of things to me is the image communicating something? Is it about something? Does it have a beating heart? And I don't believe you need to have every technical means in the world to get that across. Obviously, it can happen in animation, and it's still very moving and very indelible. It can happen with stills, like we talked about. If you're given the generosity of the real estate of time to tell a story, it shouldn't hold you back that you can't necessarily have every lens you want. It in fact can sometimes be to its detriment. I think that material answered to what the story point was well, and that's why I'm trying to show it. Aside from saying that I like to work small at times, even on a big show, I'll sometimes try to pare it down to a smaller unit for a specific sequence or shot.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about the cameras used here, Richard, we had a question from the audience whether you could speak a little bit about the different cameras and optics that you used on the various shows and movies you've shot, and some of the stuff you've just shown, and also how those chosen tools were able to aid the visual style that was intended.
Well, it's something I'd almost rather approach a little later, but almost all of that was on Aeroflex Alexa cameras. In fact, all of it except Homework, which is a Sony PD-150 with its own built-in zoom. And the optics range different optics, but mostly older lenses, things like TLS Cooks, sometimes standard primes, old Arri standard primes. And, I think maybe Boss, was ultra primes. I think Falling Water, if I'm remembering correctly, was, I'm going to have to think about that one. Manhattan was certainly ultra primes. And the Jack Ryan pilot was a mixture of super speeds and some K35 lenses, so. But, in a way, because we just screened material, and I'd love to bring in my director from Castle Rock in Manhattan, Michael Uppendahl, and talk a little bit about this process of moving from visual sources to reality, meaning the fake reality, but the on-set reality of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely. We're lucky to be joined today by Michael Uppendahl. Thank you, Michael, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Michael Uppendahl is a director that's known for his work on The Walking Dead, American Horror Story, Mad Men, Fargo, Castle Rock, and Manhattan, the last two being work that he did with Richard. So we're lucky to have the two of you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So I know a lot of questions we get, especially with as we are freelancers, how do you adapt your style when you're working with different directors? And so I think now that we have the two of you, I think it'd be really great to talk about, the steps of collaboration. What is it like when you're first getting started collaborating with someone new that you haven't worked with before?
You want me to jump in? It's kind of your show there, Richard.
Okay. Here's what I'll have to say. Sometimes it's right at the beginning of a project, and so the director you're working with is either doing a pilot or taking over from a pilot having been done and now launching the first season of a series. And that's intrinsically a different relationship than when you're in the midst of a series, you're in the midst of a long show, and a director comes in to do the 5th or the 7th or the 9th episode, and you are coming off of having already shot a good deal of material. In the second case, they have examples of the show as it stands to look at. They have dailies. Sometimes they have cuts of other scenes of episodes. If they're coming in a second season, they have a whole season to look at. So that conversation is necessarily advanced by the fact that you, the cinematographer, have already been carrying water in this realm, and you've already made some decisions, and that there are established norms with the way the writers like things, the producers like things, the producing directors like things. That said, when a director comes out and says, look, I really want to change something here, I want to try something, it makes me very excited, and I get behind it. And I say, of course, you're the director on this show, and I want to find a way that we stay in this show but make something you want to see happen. And quite often it is the best thing about that episode. One bravura thing they decided to introduce, or one way of working that we hadn't been doing before. But in the case of Michael, the second case where he came on during a series was how I met him. But then the two of us got to work together forming a new series, with people we knew in common. But at the same time, it's brand new material, and it was based on Stephen King. So there's this sort of knowledge base already about Stephen King that is brought into the mix. And what I like the most about working with Michael is that he's very clear on performance, because he has a theater background and is very, very good with actors. And he's very clear on intent. What I would say is, when I talk to him, I get a strong feeling of intent. And then he's also visually sophisticated. Not to say that if a director says to me, look, I'm not very visual, I want you to take on that, I won't do it. I'll gladly do it. I just feel like I do my best work when I'm working with people who have a visual sophistication of their own and a set of visual markers that they want to hit too. I also like it when they're willing to communicate and to be open and say, no, that's not a good direction, or that I've never seen before, that I'd like to see what we can do with. So I'll turn it over to Michael.
Yeah, we had a good time. I mean, it was nice that we've had a pretty extreme difference of environments in which we worked. When the first season of Manhattan, weirdly, Tommy had not finished his cut of the pilot when I started, and was reluctant to let me see anything. And so I really didn't see anything. I don't even think I saw dailies. I think I saw a couple of, because I requested a couple of dailies. And this has happened on several shows and I sort of enjoy that, because you get some talk like we've discussed, or something similar, some visual references, or perhaps some other films or whatever. And then you kind of build from the ground up. And we did that also because they were changing, because you had come in, I can't remember what episode. When did you start, Richard? On four. And I was 6. So, you had more experience than I had, but neither of us had done a pilot, and I hadn't even seen it. So anyway, it was fun to kind of just figure out what to do. And I remember that being the most economical shoot I think I'd ever had. And I remember feeling like we shot that in a way where we used every single shot pretty much the way we thought it would be used. And we had Rob, the great editor, who pretty instinctually went for it right away. And it was sort of like, I saw the editor's cut and I was like, that's right. This is basically correct. I don't really have to do much at all, because we were specific and ourselves correct on set because of the prep work and because of what we responded to on set, because we didn't really have much prep work. I had prep work, but you were shooting.
Right. No, we didn't get a great deal of prep time together. We basically met after hours or on weekends. And didn't we do the Bolex wedding in that episode?
We did in the next episode that you did not shoot with me, because Tommy took you for the finale.
Oh, right.
Half the reason I came back was to work with you, and then they took you away because Tommy was greedy and needed you. He got you prep and shoot the finale. And I was shooting, I guess it must have been the penultimate one. So Jeff Greeley and I shot that one. But there was a Bolex wedding that I knew that we could get. Everyone said that we couldn't do it because that show was just pure madness, as they mostly are. But that one I remember being especially difficult, of when you can shoot anything, and a tremendous amount of. I remember our first episode, it was 6.25 days that we shot it in.
Yeah.
Wow. That's impressive.
So anyway, this one I was shooting with Jeff, and I said we could do this wedding, and they said Richard cannot come, and I was like, he's around, he'll come. And they said you can't be shooting, the other episode, and I said. Just say Bolex, Bolex wedding. And Richard rolled up in a Jeep or something and practically somersaulted out the door with his Bolex and just shot the wedding in about 14 minutes at the perfect time of sunset and everything. And then he leapt back into the Jeep and off into the desert. He went to do something with Tommy.
I forgot that part of the story. I somehow forgot.
So funny.
But yeah,
it wasn't even I just knew there's no way they'd keep you away if it was. You got to shoot with the Bolex. You can always count on Richard showing up.
I love the way that footage factored in. You suddenly felt a great deal of backstory that hadn't been laid out on the page or on the screen, and you felt the joy of these young people being together. Having lives besides the physics and the worries. They're having their lives go on. I thought it was a great way to tell that bit of.
And we got to project it on bed sheet or something. I can't remember, wasn't it? Which is extra cool. Anyway,
Cool.
then we did it again, the Bolex in Castle Rock.
Yeah, which I thought worked well.
Which I was really happy with.
We got a pretty fun question here from the audience, pretty much for the two of you. Now, we all know that filmmaking is problem solving and troubleshooting, and it's always a collaboration. And as you mentioned before, you each bring inspiration to the table in various forms and discuss it with other department heads that have an impact on the look, such as scenics and stylists. Now, personalities and egos on any given film set are always different. What happens when the vision on what style or what aesthetic should actually happen doesn't perfectly align?
Well, it has to. I mean, you can't go on if it doesn't. It doesn't mean that you realize what you intended. It could be that what you intended is impossible or simply incorrect. And then you have to face that, whether it's a real hard look in the face and you got to reconceive the whole idea of what you're doing, or whether it's a more pleasant version of just accepting the things that come up. And it's like, we thought this would be all dark in here or whatever. And it just turns out that because of the performance or because of the, production design, who knows, maybe you wanted to see it more than you thought. Or, I mean, you have to be open to the channels, and you will arrive at the right part of the river if you have the right people working in collaboration with you, as we've been lucky to have in each other and the people that we've been lucky enough to work with. And then if you don't, then you have to be, at least I have to be as the director, I feel you have to be the keeper of the story and make the correct decision whether the crew is with you or not. I've almost never been in a situation where the whole crew is against you. People see what's going on and contribute to something that might be a completely different thing than what you intended from the beginning. But it should be superior, because at that point of filming, everyone knows more than they've ever known before. So whatever you thought about in your little room when I was prepping before I was on set with Richard, if it could just be Richard, by the way, because we didn't prep, and it could be something where I said, I always thought it would be like this, and he would say, this is going to be really difficult for lighting, or the lighting will be so much nicer over here because of probably the sun, given the way we shot that show. Then I would be persuaded into that, and I would say, okay, well, screw the silhouette. You're right. This person looks beautiful, and it's better for the story, and maybe we have to alternate something from there. Anyway, I'm a firm believer that you do arrive at the correct look, aesthetic, everything, if you're in service to the story, and almost undoubtedly people are going to be right in there with you. If not, then you have the lonesome road, and you got to make some changes, so it's not lonesome. But it shouldn't be lonesome, and almost never is. Certainly
yeah, I think what's interesting that both of you use this adjective, and I think it's really a takeaway for the viewers, is being open. I think as a DP or any creative, and also as a director, you have to be open to where the story has taken you. Like you said, in that moment, you know more than you did in pre-pro, and I think that's a really interesting takeaway.
One thing I'll comment on is, like we started and showed all those still images, paintings, and we'll talk about, music is also a reference. I'm deeply moved by music. I remember Mike Coulter and Jonathan Freeman, when they did Rubicon, talked about playing music on set prior to executing takes to set a pace, set a mood. And I think that music affects me a great deal. As a lot of people will tell you that work with me, I'm quite often thinking about a song for the scene, but in any case.
Sure.
But the point I was going to make is that I've had the opportunity ahead of time to sit alone with a director, sometimes just the two of us, sometimes with a production designer or a prop person or a costume designer, and talk about things at an aesthetic level, a sort of, an abstracted place that isn't on the stage floor trying to cover the amount of work of the day. That's a great privilege, and then it's my responsibility to translate that out to key crew members, to gaffer, grip, operators especially, focus pullers especially, even second ACs, basically anyone I think needs to know something that's going to help achieve what the director and I managed to get down in terms of a visual look or a visual idea. And it can even go to the boom operator, to me having to talk to a boom operator prior to a day and saying, sometimes we're going to do 50-50 here, which means I'm going to roll the camera and I'm not going to announce it, per the director looking at me. And so keep your eyes on us because we'll do that. And so the information gathered in pre-production is so important because then it spreads out, it fans out, and it feeds a group of 80, 90 people. And the more effective a communicator and the more enthusiastic a communicator I am, the better that will be, because a gaffer like Scotty Davis on Castle Rock, I love Massachusetts, by the way, can't wait to get back to Massachusetts, will say, this isn't what you usually do. And he's right. I'll turn to him and say, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. I've turned on one too many lights. And that's an important relationship that essentially goes unseen. You know, Michael and I get to have this conversation. That conversation flows out into the crew. And I will also talk to the crew about a director coming in. This director, she doesn't like to raise her voice. So we have to be good listeners around her. I need you guys not to be chatty while we're setting up blocking. Or I'll say, this director doesn't like to move the camera. So if we're going to introduce the idea of a moving shot, we're going to have a significant justification for that moving shot. We're going to have it play out within his or her aesthetic. I mean, that's a job we owe. That's why we're hired. So I like that I get to have that conversation early, but I'm completely aware that the director does not get to have a crew of 80 or 90 that have worked with him for months already. He or she has to come to the set as a newbie and yet run that set. So it's incumbent on me to bring those aesthetics forward, to say, this is a reference. And sometimes I'll literally pull out my phone and say, this is what this person likes, or look back at this episode they did on something because it's strong. And that's part of my job as well. And while that may not immediately be visible in a shot or a sequence that we're going to put on the show, it certainly makes the work happen. And so I take on that responsibility to make sure that the communication I've had is clearly put out. And as you can see, I can talk about it so much. Less vocal.
No, that's great. I'm curious, you know, Michael, Richard talked about how some directors working with are very specific, you know, in terms of how something is shot, equipment used. You know, when you two have worked together, especially because you referenced the Bolex, what is it like for you collaborating with DPs? You know, do you like to have input in those choices, the technical choices, or what's that conversation like for you?
I suppose in my ideal conversation, I would be explicit in what I wanted to achieve, either specifically about where the camera would go and how it would go over here or whatever, or just in a story intent. But then I would very much prefer to have the input of, you know, gaffers and camera, I mean, all kinds of different people to tell me how to render it, because I don't pretend that I have an authoritative knowledge of the available instruments, especially as they change frequently. And I don't really want to have it. And so you gain it as you go along, and there are certain things that usually you get sort of screwed by a producer and you realize that you have to know a term in order to order it, or the crew won't be allowed to. You have to go in and say, God damn it, I need this particular crane, you know, and if you know what you're talking about, you have a better chance of getting it. But usually I would, even in a case like that, I would run it by Richard, who would then run it by the appropriate people, and we would all be in complete agreement that we wanted a piece of equipment that was really expensive and that it was going to be effective in what we wanted to do, first of all, and that it was going to be efficient, because otherwise, you know, we all know these things can be very dangerous. So I do prefer to hear from the people what they recommend, because they are professionals and they're more expert in it than I am. But over the years, I have tried to learn a little bit more. I would say at this beat, kind of open my ears a little bit more to it, to allow the information to come in, because it has sadly become more important to know than I wish it did. Ideally, I probably in Fantasyland wouldn't really know, and I would just show up on set and like, what the hell is that? Look at that thing, you know. But you kind of can't. If someone says, why are you asking for something that's this expensive? You have to be able to answer.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You don't have to get in depth with it, but a good foundation is helpful, especially now.
And I like to be able to ask that too, because someone will come to me and even I will say, like, are you kidding me? This shot is going to be that? No way. And there was a shot in Castle Rock, remember, Richard, that ended up being in the beginning when when Pangborn is out by the tree and he discovers the boy on the lake. Yeah. And I always wanted this descending shot that was going to be coming directly over his head and right directly on top of his head, as though if it kept going, you would, you know, go right into his skull. this became nearly impossible to achieve. But I kept vaguely fighting for it. I mean, I wasn't someone who was going to scream on the hill, but I would go on the tech scouts and things and say, like, this is what I would like. And I would kind of walk away while people talk about it, as I tend to do, because a lot of it I don't need to know. I don't want to be seduced by figures being thrown around as cheaper or more expensive. I don't really care. I really want it to be the correct thing. Honestly, what happened there is that it became impossible, because it would have been, that shot could have been achieved at the sacrifice of like 7 other shots. So to me, that's impossible. That story math doesn't work. That production math doesn't work. So what we did is a slight variation where it has a little bit of an arc to it, which I've come to prefer, partially because I have never seen the shot that I saw in my mind, because we couldn't do it. We could do it, but it wasn't worth it. Right. And I'm very happy with that shot, and it made it into the cut. And still, that was not easy to achieve, by the way. It was that shot was for some reason difficult. It was because it was over by the lake, and anyway, whatever. It worked out. It was an equipment sort of situation of just because we didn't have enough time to move things in and out. But that's an example of an adjustment that I think became of equipment and was the right move, because I really love that whole sequence, and I happen to know that we would have lost several shots. We just wouldn't have had time to do them, and we wouldn't have done them, and we would have had what would have been my idea of a superior shot, which I haven't thought of in a long time, frankly, because it doesn't exist, and the one that we've got was great.
What I remember was that location, they wouldn't let us chop down even one little sapling.
Yeah, exactly.
So in order to put the pads in place to get a real construction crane in and then do a descender move, it would have been this massive mess. And then ironically,
it would have taken all this time to get in and out, or, it would have eaten up valuable time. The only time we have, if you eat it up, it doesn't come back. Those shots never get shot.
I mean, that sequence, then the whole discovery of the young Henry Deaver on the frozen lake was so successful with the running car and the frozen morning and everything, that it became the opening of the entire season. It became the opening of the entire show, because they've moved things around in the edit. I'm reminded of the story of us going on this naval destroyer in San Diego Harbor. Jack Ryan has incredible access to military stuff. So, one day in San Diego Harbor in late 2018, we had 2 naval destroyers at our disposal, one at sea for helicopter shots, and one in the harbor with a Black Hawk landing on it. And we're doing this dialogue scene, this intense, that sort of buddy comedy dialogue between Greer and Jack. And we're doing some shots of it handheld. And Krasinski looks over at me and he goes, well, I guess they gave us this $1 billion boat to do some handheld indie filmmaking. And I'm like, yep, that's how this has turned out. And partly it's just simpler. You can't move any of these metal fixtures on a boat like that. It's all very engineered in. So forget laying dolly track. It's just not going to happen, So.
I love that. I love hearing how you have, obviously your intent and staying true to the story intent, and also the concept that you had, Michael, but then also obviously adapting, because there is that element of logistical, just like Richard was saying early on, that there's always an element of logistical decisions that you have to adapt to.
If I didn't have a handle on the logistical, I wouldn't be here talking to you. There's no room on larger shows. I mean, maybe do small, very, very, very carefully, beautifully aesthetic indies and go from one of those to another one of those. In shows that move and engineer their schedule to the pace that Michael and I have grown to, work in, you're pragmatic or you're gone. I don't care how nice you are. You're going to have to be pragmatic. I'm happy to talk to some of your viewers about that later, because I struggle to put the aesthetic first, but my eye is also on time and money. So.
Right. Yeah. And as you mentioned earlier, you're also essentially managing the crew. So there's an element of that as well.
Yeah. When they aren't managing me, which happens.
Right. Right.
We have some other questions from viewers, or did everybody tune out once the thing got interrupted?
No, I know we've got a couple of questions. I know one thing I want to mention is you're saying everything so thoroughly. I think you're doing such a nice job, Richard. So thank you for that.
Okay.
But Alex, go ahead. I know you mentioned you've got a couple questions from the audience.
Yes, I have a couple on deck. The first one might be the most fun one out of the bunch, if you ask me. One member in the audience was wondering, Richard, if you have a favorite film camera, if you're shooting 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter.
You know, I spent a long time working with an Aton. First, I had an Aton LTR 54 Super 16 millimeter camera, and it fit right on my shoulder, and it moved quickly, and I really enjoyed working with that camera. Now, one of the things when we started moving over to all digital capture is things started to get a little cumbersome. At first with the Sony 900s, there were wires that had to go to a DIT tent, and then there were issues with how long the batteries would last, and then once built up, they became very enormous and very heavy. So I became convinced that there had to be a better way, and I started, and actually on Boss with the camera assistant Chris Dame, who's quite wonderful, we figured out how to pare down the package. Boss was based on Gus Van Zant's idea that it could be like the movie Primary, which was a Ricky Leacock documentary from 1960. And it should have that access, that feeling of immediacy. You're with the candidate at a rally. You're with the candidate in their car. You're privy to the hidden fears and the hidden turmoil inside somebody who holds an outward public appearance. So we really pared the camera down and did most of that show handheld. And my whole thing was, if it can't be as efficient and speedy and work user-friendly as Super 16, then this isn't an advancement. And I realized that, of course, the lab is now in the camera. Out comes a card goes in your computer, you've already got your footage. In some cases, it's already got a look laid on it, depending on how you do your color workflow. I still want it to be as quick and as efficient as what I experienced in Super 16. I also like the Arri SR3s. The 416 is, of course, really good. Now they've got HD taps on those. I just like to be able to take the camera to the next setup, put it down, look through an eyepiece, not be worried whether it's plugged in or not, and get the next shot. Because once you've got the next shot up on the monitor, everyone, the director, wardrobe, scenic, sound, everybody starts to now understand, okay, this is the next shot. This is what we're concentrated on next, and these are the parameters. I think it's very important to be able to move flexibly like that. I do enjoy putting 35 in the film cameras still. Movie Cam Compact was a go-to for many years, and now Arri Cam LTs and STs. If someone would say to me, Richard, I want to do a little film on a 35 millimeter, and we're only going to have 100 rolls of film, I'd be like, I'm doing it. Here we go. But really, that's a bit of a misnomer, because everything depends on content. So it comes out of content. You look at a script, and some scripts say there's got to be something that's retro or textural about this for film, and then you choose film, if they'll let you.
Right. I'm curious with the show you mentioned you were using Bolex. What was it cutting with? What else were you using?
That was all with Alexa okay. Mini, Alexa SXT, and it was to a specific purpose. Michael, you can talk about this, but to me, it was to say it's an interior memory piece, and it's got distortions, and it's got things wrong with it. We would open the door of the camera to get a flash, or we'd rewind the film, or we'd disconnect the motor and crank the film by hand, and then let that have a stuttery quality, those flashes of exposure change. Supposed to be
all very specifically from the point of view of a child too, who was in a cage. So we of course shot some of the boy, but it was mostly quite specifically his point of view. So that was an interesting thing to think, essentially, of course, we would move the camera appropriately, but you were sort of thinking mostly what did it look like from here, and what would you remember of something that you don't specifically remember and are haunted by and maybe infected by or taken over by nightmares over the years. You don't even know what's real. So the image itself would become very important. So then we would sort of molest it weirdly to see what would happen in the camera. Richard would know. For me, I honestly didn't really know. Let's go back again. I don't know. And we would kind of mess around. But Richard knows that camera backwards and forwards, so he knew the effects, and we got to play a lot with the light. Literally, there was a light bulb that we used as a cutting tool and kind of a sort of an anchor to the images.
Right.
Wow, that sounds really cool.
While we're on the topic of cinematography, another user question came in, which is probably a little bit more towards cinematographers that are starting out. Richard, what would you say are some of the most basic skills and steps that every DP should make to make sure that they get the best that they could for every single shot?
Maintain your health. Be enthusiastic. Be there right with everybody. Doesn't matter if you're not laying the track that morning. Get there as soon as you can and be there right with everybody. And say thank you to everyone at the end of the day. Then teach yourself cinematography. But without that fundamental working discipline, I believe people do not bring the best they can to the screen. It's just me, but.
No, I think that's great. Mike, I think that'd be interesting to hear from you too, from a director's perspective. What do you think when you're getting ready to get a shot?
I mean, I'm always trying to make sure that I have the story really firmly in my mind, the forest and the trees, where the scene comes in, where the shot fits into the scene, in the whole thing, because that is really my responsibility to make sure that of the possible things that you could shoot, we get the right ones that tell the story in the most effective way. So I think if you don't, first of all, you have to have an understanding of what that is, and then you have to have an honest, sober appraisal of whether you are succeeding in this particular image for the part of the scene you think it's going to be used for. Or, of course, sometimes a shot just comes up, whether it's like a B or C camera, like Layla, a camera person that we used, would come up with some great shots just way off that we wouldn't even, she would pitch, sometimes. There's that sort of thing, but most of the time you have to be quite specific about the shot that you want. But by that, I mean more the story point that you want. And you have to be honest about whether you're achieving it and whether you feel it at the screen, on the monitor, on the day, or however you're watching it. If you're supposed to feel an emotion, whether it's humor or sadness, or even, you should have a pretty good idea of what you're supposed to feel. And then you have to be honest with yourself about whether you're achieving it. And if you're not, do you have to adjust either performance or something about the frame or where the camera is or the lighting or something else? But you have to be the one to say, this doesn't feel right. For me, I tend to sweat a lot, and I start to get, I can diagnose physical things that my body does where I'm like, something's wrong here. Right. And it's frustrating because sometimes you might not know, but you have to find out and you have to fix it. And I bet Richard I can't think of anything offhand, but I'm sure I've gone to Richard and said, this doesn't feel right, or I think we're going to need another shot, or we're definitely not done with this scene. These are the shots we talked about, but I don't know. This middle part, we need something. And, it might just be something where I'm that vague about it. Of like, I don't ever feel like I was scared enough or something. And then he would say, what about a shot right here or through the bar or something, to save me? Or I would come up with it myself and say, I actually, because of the things that I'm witnessing, because I get to roam around a little more than Richard might, because I do actually have some more free time, I think, than the director of photography generally does. And I might be wandering over there and see a shot and like, oh, this tells me this, and we could use it here. And then I go to Richard with this ad news that we have to somehow absorb into our schedule, which we're probably already behind another shot. And Richard would feel the innate value of it as a storyteller and would make it happen. And then it would go down the line of all the people that have to make it happen, would make it happen improbably in a way that the time doesn't technically allow, because when you're on the side of the story, you get the superpowers that allow you to achieve more than you do.
Right. Yeah, I love that gut check that you mentioned, where it's like your mind-body experience. Your body's telling you that something's wrong. I like that.
No, I do remember these. I do remember these occasions, and I remember specifically one tracking shot where Michael wisely said, this would be so much better if we just kept going. And my practical was, ooh, that's going to be hard. But then I was like, yes, we have to get additional tracking. We have to keep the move going. It'll be better. I wish I'd seen it, that sort of thing. And also, there's a certain body language. Like, you get done with a take, and some people will tell you, like, they can tell right away when they look at me whether they feel like I'm totally satisfied. And I'll look at the director will look at me, and sometimes if they see me jumping up and down very happily by the monitor, they're like, no, okay, Richard really thinks that went well. I'm not a cipher in that regard. But
Yeah, I always at least check in with the DP. I mean, if you've worked together as much as we have, it probably is a look most of the time. But
Yeah.
you know, if Richard was unhappy with something, I would almost always go again, unless it was something really unique that you couldn't possibly get again in another take, and we really didn't remember something. But I can't remember denying a take if Richard said there was something he needed to go again for some reason.
Right. Yeah, I think that
All right.
trust that you.
So I know we're a little bit past the 3 o'clock, but given the interruptions, I wonder if we can we still have a couple questions?
Yeah, I think we're going to go about 5 to 10 minutes over, and I think Alex has another one for us. Oh, he just got kicked out, so I'll ask it for him. So let me look back over here. I know one of them was, Richard, and for Mike, actually, we talked a little bit about technology, obviously, and staying on top of it and it changing, but not letting it overpower. Are there things, again, not thinking something specifically technical, but just in general, is there something that you feel like you want to do that you haven't been able to do? Or do you feel like, camera technology there's so many things to choose from?
Well, I'll start with cameras. Now there's larger format cameras, and so some people have been using Sony Venice, and I really love this new Aeroflex, sort of the medium format where they've got essentially twice the sensor size. I feel like that's something I haven't fully exploited yet. The shift to larger deliverables. It used to be like, oh, you're just delivering 1080. Now you're delivering 2K. Now you're delivering 4K. So the shift to larger deliverables has been a slow progression over the last 3 or 4 years. I'm excited to do something in the large format. I think it's very beautiful. I think people's eyes and minds have become accustomed to this sharper image. Like when HDR first came out, and people were doing HDR shows. At first it seemed like a little much. It seemed like a little too contrasty, a little too much color. You're seeing into the black a little too much to feel normal. Then your eye gets used to it, and then you're like, oh, actually, this is quite beautiful, and I should be exploiting this for what it's worth. Why not have the detail in the clouds that I used to give up on? Just say that's going to be zone 10 and I'm not going to see it. Now I can bring that detail back. So I'm excited to work with some of these new larger format cameras. And I've been working on a show that got interrupted by COVID called Your Honor. We're going to go back to that in about a month. And that show was on the Sony Venice, which is exceptional, and I like it. I'd like to do a show with the Aeroflex version of it as well. I'm more accustomed to how those LUTs and that sensor works. I'm interested to exploit that. Mm-hmm. So that's something specific. Also, I love landscape. I love the big wide tableau of a landscape, and what better format. And I believe that when you linger on landscape, you create a context for your story and your character that has a meaningful impact on the audience. I quite often say context is character.
Yeah, I know we touched on earlier that, when full format first came out, there weren't enough lenses, and now we do have a lot of lens choices. So again, opening up those options as a look. Mike, how about you? What intrigues you?
To be honest, I don't lust after any particular technology. I have always been satisfied with whatever we arrived at, whether it was a Bolex or a drone, although not always satisfied with drones. Maybe I would wish for a better relationship with drones. We've had some real success, and they've been kind of great in a lot of ways, but I do find them difficult. And anyway, but I would say I don't list for any particular technology.
Edge of Democracy, great drone work.
What's that?
The Edge of Democracy, this doc in Brazil, amazing drone work, like the best I've ever seen.
We've done good drone work. I'm just saying it's a difficult. The teams are tricky. Anyway, it all depends on who you get, like everything else. There's nothing in particular that I look for. I'm always happy when we come up with things. I'm frequently amazed at how happy I am when I'm presented with a lens like by a DP or something that's from, Russia in the 70s or something. And I don't think that we've exhausted the tools that we have. I don't think that, I welcome all the new tools, and I'm always excited to use them, and they're usually fun and good. But there's such a wealth of inventory of tools that I never feel like there's a deficit. And I feel it only really is appropriate to activate in service to a story. And then you've got to get the right tools, and there you go. And then you stick with them for that particular project. You know?
Absolutely.
Now, you guys both talked a little bit about LUTs, and of course, you've talked about the look overall that you aspire for a show or a movie. Now, one position on the camera side that can help very much so aspire that look is the DIT. How much do you guys like to collaborate with the DIT? Like, has that made your workflow on set easier, or do you discuss the look beforehand, or how is your overall working relationship with them?
From my own perspective, I haven't usually used a DIT, and some of that was for speed, feeling like I was going to be perhaps slower or perhaps having to interact on too many questions. And I preferred in a way to think of the camera more like a film camera where you didn't need an additional person. I've come around more lately to working with them, but working with them in a very specific range of questions, and the help they can offer is actually quite strong. And especially if what you're doing is live grading stills at the end of the day. I like doing that because then I can sort of flip through the memory bank of the day's work, and make some basic changes that then go on to the dailies stage. And then it all just comes out better. And my goal is always to have the dailies look as close as possible to what everybody wants as the end product.
Yeah, I enjoy working with them. It honestly depends almost entirely on the director of photography. I think if I was working with Richard and he didn't want to have one, I wouldn't push for one. I can't imagine. But whenever I have worked with one that is good, I just worked with Brian McGregor, who's a great one, and I've always had a good time with him. I find him really actually quite helpful and useful, and not an extra wheel or an extra piston in the engine, an actual contributor and collaborator, and that I find really satisfying that you do get to see the actual image there. Pretty closely to what it'll ultimately be, which of course you can still manipulate, but it's nice to get it so that when people are watching dailies and everything, any opportunity you have to tell the people who are involved in the production what you're trying to do by presenting successful images, which happens shot after shot on set, and hopefully the crew starts to say, oh, this is what we like. This is how we're doing this. And then it starts to go more smoothly. And that's true of dailies for whoever watches them. You never really know who the hell's watching them, but if someone is watching them upstairs, it's nice for them to get an idea of like, okay, this is what they're after, not like wait till you see it later, because frankly you're lucky if they've seen it at all, because a lot of people don't watch dailies, and if they do, you should be telling them what the hell you're doing, and for everyone else, so that everyone's on board more and more about the kind of images you're making for this particular story, so that it starts to get easier and easier and better and better.
Right.
I totally agree, and I feel like from my working method, the DIT position has evolved, and that I think it's really now, especially moving up to large format or to some of the very shallow depths of field we're working in. It's a much more critical and helpful position, and also the attitude of the position has changed. It used to be, oh, I'm protecting you from being too dark. Well, sometimes I want it that dark.
Right. Yeah.
From having that window be blown out, and I'll have to say, no, that's the whole idea. The window's blown out. We're going to pan off of that window, and then the exposure is going to come in. But rather than have that conversation, I think most DITs have started to understand how they can more successfully integrate their work into what I'm after. And to be honest, the last DIT relationship I had was fantastic down in New Orleans. He's a really great guy and has helped me tremendously to improve dailies.
Yeah, I like hearing you talk about, you get to show the intent of the story, Mike, as you mentioned, like, so everyone's on board the whole time.
I will say, just as an addendum to that, as a thought, it did occur to me, I do honestly miss shooting film, and we did shoot some film on Castle Rock, a fair amount, actually. I mean, not a big percentage, but we did a fair amount. And I do miss the leap of faith of that, which was just the same kind of thing, because you didn't have the image there. Sometimes, you wouldn't even have the image at all. Sometimes it would go to snow, like depending on what kind of, and even if you did see it, you wouldn't see a really accurate rendering of what the image would ultimately be. So you still had to have the same process going on of your own appraisal of is it successful, and your own contribution from all of the people, from the camera people, but you may not even perceive a focus pull that went on until you watch it the next day in dailies, and then you get an extra satisfaction of, wow, they were really on board so much that they did something I didn't even know, and they were completely correct because they knew the point of this part of the story, and they were right, and I wouldn't have even asked for it. And I always found that really satisfying. So I kind of miss that, but I do think it's essentially the exact same thing. You just have to make sure that the people who are there on the day working on it know what the point is, and feel empowered to contribute.
Right. So I think I've definitely got one last one before we close here for both of you. I always like to end with, a little bit more aspirational, and especially since a lot of us are, doing the stay at home and hopefully slowly, safely gearing out of that. What are the types of things that, you feel like you're doing at home, either watching things, viewing things, working on things? Is there anything you've been able to do to kind of keep that creativity going? In your mind and in your in your body of work and everything? The tough one.
Well, for me, I'm certainly watching a number of things. I guess the only thing in particular I can say is I did put together basically a lookbook for a project that doesn't really need it or want it. It's kind of it's not really necessarily going to come into play as a selling factor to something, but I felt like it was something I wanted to kind of articulate for myself. So I made it in collaboration with someone who I know who's a props master, who we talked about So anyway, I was happy that I got it, and I was happy that I made it, and it felt very satisfying for me to present something that, like, if I was to work with Richard, for example, on this, or down to costumes, I would like to think that anyone could look at this and get a really good idea of what we're going for, and that they would be inspired and not limited by it.
Right. That's great.
I look forward to seeing it.
Yeah.
I have had the ability to do some shooting. Ellen Curris of the ASC started a project called Chronicle, in which she put together the ASC with different like organizations around the world. So the BSC, the CSC, and on to China and Japan and Russia. And cinematographers have essentially been offered gear. Thank you to Able Cine. I have a Mira with a Cabrio lens on it available. And I go out and I shoot images since this whole pandemic shutdown started, really since around the 23rd or 27th of March. And I shoot images to try and document this particular moment. And because you can't go out with crew or anything, my wife Betsy, who's a visual artist, has gone out with me, and we shoot together, and it's been totally fantastic. And one of the things it reminds me of, like that clip from Homework, where you're just working very small and incredibly observational, is that you can create very moving pictures without all the apparatus. You simply have to keep your mind and your eye open. And boy, the look of New York City and the surrounding areas changed immediately, and it got very interesting. I mean, I'm standing out in the middle of Fifth Avenue in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art with no traffic, nobody, and just filming, and going into Grand Central Station, nothing happening. 6 people in the place, 4 of them are police.
Wow.
Like stuff you just don't even imagine that you could see. Really incredible. But then also, like, you're starting to think, like, well, what is the picture of this? What are the effects of this? How do we film this and give a future audience, 5, 6, 8 years down the line, a picture of what this time was like? And then it rounded itself into protests over George Floyd, and isn't that a big contrast? Like, nobody can be together until, of course, 5,000 of us can be in one place at the same time, all doing the same thing silently. It was very moving.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm grateful for that. Aspirationally, I wanted to get back to doing some reading, so I got to do some reading, plant a garden, be home, cook with the family.
Yeah.
All that great. And then in terms of watching things, I really haven't gone and binged watched things like a lot of my friends have done, but I have been watching documentaries and some older films. And so I did get to show a film that my wife and daughter had never seen, called Alice in the Cities, which is a Wim Wenders film made on Super 16 millimeter, very simply. And it's such a beautiful storyline told so simply, in a time capsule, and marvelous performances, and a sense that there was just a lot of love in the making of it. And that was a special opportunity to just have a night to sit down and look at that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, I got to be introduced to doing this podcast, and I guess it's live stream, and seeing Mike, who we haven't seen each other in a while, going around without a mask and things like that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much to both of you, Michael and Richard, for joining us. And thank you to our audience for watching. You two were very captivating. And Richard, thank you for collecting all those images and allowing us to view them and your body of work with you.
Well, thank you guys. And absolutely, I know that not a lot of the viewers' questions got in, and I would like to make myself available. So I think you guys are going to give away my email or something. And I'm here and happy to talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm happy to talk to you. Thank you very much. It's been a treat. It's great to talk to you, Richard, and to meet everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next week. We're back on with another live stream next Tuesday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.